It's on. We have two guest artists today, and I think you're going to find it rather important because a lot of the directions in contemporary media will be discussed here. The first guest is Professor Margot Lovejoy, a professor of visual arts at the State University of New York at Purchase. Among a long, long list of things that she's done, she's the author of Postmodern Currents, Art and Artists in the Age of Electronic Media, that came out in '97. She received the Guggenheim in the year afterward, in 1994, an Arts International Grant in India. She's exhibited internationally. Should look more exhausted than she is. She's had many solo exhibitions in and around New York at the Alternative Museum, PS1, Contemporary Art Center, Newhouse Center for Contemporary Art, Queens Museum of Art, Newburgh Museum of Art, Stanford Museum, and Islip Museum. She's also in the collection at Museum of Modern Art at the Getty, and on. Numerous essays she's published, visual books, one Labyrinth in 1991, Book of Plagues in 1995. A very complicated, very full experience that she has to bring to you. Professor Margot Lovejoy.
Can you put this on? Where should we do it?
You could put it on there, sure.
Okay, now we have to clip this to your belt or someplace. Put it in
Okay,
a pocket
just a
if you
sec. Put this up here. We should have done this first. Why not here? Yeah, pocket is good. Okay. This is for your recording.
want. Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hello. I arrived last night on campus, and I didn't have a map. So I just started walking, and I decided perhaps this is the best way of getting to know a place. And I started thinking about it today that it has a lot to do with experiencing something instead of really being told about it or guided, and that this has a lot to do with new kind of art that is growing. So I decided to mention this as a way of thinking about where we're going, that we're creating a sort of art that has to do with experience. And of course, I enjoyed very much my tour of the campus, seeing the jacaranda trees in bloom and discovering the museums. And however, I couldn't find anywhere to eat. So the kind of quotes that I've been putting up here are just sort of to give you a background to the kind of thinking that I've been undergoing myself, and to try to just give my talk a bit of a frame. I'm speaking to you really as an artist interested in aesthetic values, the construction of meaning, and advances in perception brought about by new technologies. I divided my talk into two sections. First, I'd like to discuss what I mean by the term trans-aesthetics that I'm naming my talk today. Secondly, I'd like to discuss aura in relation to the construction of meaning in interactive works, and show you some of my work and the crossing over of media which has taken place in it. So about trans-aesthetics, I see this term as a useful marker in the passage into new territory, these new conditions that we're living in, where different questions can be asked about the logic and the grammar, the poetics of emergent forms. However, as Frederick Jameson reminds us in his analysis to the shift in postmodernism, quote, radical breaks between periods do not generally involve complete changes, but rather the restructuration of a certain number of elements already given. One can say that despite all the radical change around us today, All art expression is an attempt to create parameters of a metaphorical world through techniques of interpretation and representation which engage viewers in what all humans do, to try to make meaning out of the world. It is through this lens that I'm speaking to you today. Let's start with the self as an aspect of trans-aesthetics, or the transmodern. And I'm referring to this quote: "The postmodern self is a decentered one, dispersed with no historically coherent sense of ego due to the dismantling and dispersion of hierarchical systems." However, Rushing and friends propose in their book Projecting the Shadow that trans-aesthetics involves the human imperative not to banish the ego, but to reestablish its link with its simulations as well as its inner self. Donna Haraway, in her Cyborg Manifesto, finds reason to celebrate the dissolution of boundaries that others lament losing. She sees the trans-aesthetic, transmodern state as one where humans should accept the new machine-body, mind-body construct as part of our beings, as part of ourselves. Quote, "The machine is us, our processes, an aspect of our embodiment. We can be responsible for machines. They do not dominate or threaten us. We are responsible for the boundaries. We are they." Could you show the internet, please? Also, the trans-aesthetic perspective does not accept the fatalistic vacuum of meaning of the postmodern because it posits a platform from which we can view the larger whole, from which its pieces have been atomized. Trans-aesthetics refers to the changed state of cultural consciousness where there is some awareness of the wholeness and interconnectedness of the universe and the oneness of all things. This also applies to connectedness between disciplines and forms of representation where text, sound, and image relations meet in the development of new media forms and the new methods of cognition. So I hope you're going to enjoy this particular website. It's a thesaurus called, there it is, yes. So this is, to me, an incredible way of thinking about words, of thinking about new kinds of meanings, and part of what I'm thinking of in terms of the trans-aesthetic or transmodern kind of period that we're in, which I believe is going beyond the negativity of postmodernism into this other territory. Trans-aesthetic implies interactivity as the new structure for art. The relationship between art and its public is changing. Artwork is now about creating communication structures as new forms. Interactive implies omnidirectionality. Something which lies between people is intermediary and therefore can relate and bind them together. It is a speaking between, similar to the power of montage in the construction of meaning. And that's actually a form that I've used a lot that you'll see in work I'm going to show you, use of montage as a strategy. So the idea of speaking between, where one goes inside oneself to seek one's own response as a means of self-realization. It offers new possibilities for transgressing old boundaries and limits of linear systems of thought and of cultural production, which have had the effect of stifling more direct dialogic communication. Roy Ascott speaks about communication as what happens in the mind when two people are speaking together, what happens to create a meaning that goes on between the people who are dialoguing. If up to now art has had the ability to bring out in us the desire or interest to participate in negotiating meaning, new interactive technologies, now themselves embodied as forms of communication, have heightened this means of communication. The positioning of the viewer in an interactive digital work is unique and unprecedented. The interactive digital work may each time be restructured and recreated by the activity of viewers. Questions most frequently asked by artists contemplating use of interactive media concern the loss of their usual control over a discrete work. How much control will the viewer have to direct the flow of the piece? How much can be altered or changed in the work? Will its intentions become diluted? At what point does it seem less interesting to artists if there's too much loss to the work's original intent or meaning? How can meaning be negotiated in such a work? Can aura be related to digital artworks? These questions bring me to the second part of my talk about the construction of meaning and aura. The relationship between artwork and participant where meaning is negotiated was conceptualized as part of the aura of an artwork by cultural critic Walter Benjamin. Today, with new technologies playing such an intrinsic role in many contemporary artists' works, the relationship between the construction of meaning and aura is undergoing fresh analysis. Aside from his celebrated essay, 1936, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, scholars are examining the range of his thinking on different aspects of aura, as reflected in his newly translated writings. I guess you're probably aware of the fact that Harvard University Press has come out with, I think they have one more volume of his collected works, and it's opening a whole range of new thinking related to his work because of the translations. Aura refers to a work's origins, its source, its uniqueness. Benjamin maintained, amongst other claims, that when an artwork is reproduced, its function and value is changed. It becomes more important as a form of communication than as an object. Because today's communication technologies are themselves used to create art, I felt that a short review of Benjamin's various writings on aura could be useful in thinking about the construction of meaning in interactive new media. Benjamin pointed out that the fullest extent of aura is felt when, quote, the person we look at or who feels she is being looked at looks at us in return. To perceive the aura of the object we look at means to invest it with the ability to look at us in return. An interactive process. The power to return our gaze of an art object is an aspect of its power to provide an essential experience or level of feeling which may later translate to consciousness, insight, or meaning. Conscious insight or meaning. The experience of aura in a work is then transposed from the look of the eye to the eye of the mind. Here, a responsive aura becomes established between an artwork similar to that which has the ability to look at us in return, to the aura as the experience of returning our gaze. We can say that aura is connected to a dialogic process which occurs between viewer and artwork where meaning may be negotiated. Critical to this endeavor is the artist's position as a maker based in the now as the work's auratic origin. The artist must produce new work that originates as an essence or aura, a dialectic outcome of dealing with the contemporary as an experience based in the present. The openness of an interactive work can be discussed in another of Benjamin's descriptions of aura, not as the source, quote, but a whirlpool in the river of becoming that pulls the merging matter into its own rhythm, unquote. This is a form of connection to contention, a place for seeking the initiation of communication. It is this very speaking between the social relations in the positioning of both agents, the artist, the participant, that can clarify the effect of interactive forms. Salvage, a recent work of mine created with Miles Dudgeon, was an attempt to deal with the poetics and construction of meaning in a multi-user interactive work and raised for me many questions. Could we show Salvage, please? In Salvage, I wanted to explore the power of memory to affect and heal the present. By interactively searching through the hidden debris of the past, viewers connect with avenues of contemplation and possibly transformation. The work was created in 3 parts: probe, myth, and salvage. These projected elements slide, move, and are displaced variably in relation to each other according to the actions of viewers within the multi-user environment. With probe, the idea was that the viewer could be involved in seeking out hidden parts, salvaging traumatic memories from the past. In this case, it was seen in the wreck of a ship underwater. And when memories of various traumas were coming up on the screen, possibly a memory would trigger some deep area of the person's experience, and that passing into the myth area, again, all of these efforts to come into these different parts of the work had to be random kind of choices where the viewer would be touching sensors within the space, as you'll see. And then the transformation, the idea of changing the story into a myth, the trauma becoming a myth, and then possibly moving into an area. So this was the first installation of this work. This is the documentation. Of course, it's very difficult to document an interactive work. And so I simply try to give you an idea of how it works, that viewers can touch the sensors around the room, which then change different parts of the work. In the next installation of the work, I used tall pillars in the space, so it looked rather different. The work is very slow-moving. The idea was to try to create an environment where the viewer would go and be able to stay and feel a meditative kind of surrounding, rather than with a lot of movement and sound that would not allow for that to happen. Yes, the sound was of being underwater, yes. So this is a section called Probe, where these traumas can be accessed, or views of trauma. The myth section. So there are these 3 discrete parts of the work. No, it's all seen on one screen, like this. 3. You only see one at a time. Mm-hmm. again the myth area. Yes, well, you were in a room and you had sensors that were around the whole room. So there were about 9 sensors, and those would come on, and you can see people pressing on the sensor, and that would bring up from the database different responses, whether it was to bring you into a myth section where you might find some imagery that would help you to transform the process that you were going through as a kind of healing process or kind of thinking process. And then there was the segment called salvage, where you would emerge back up into reality, into the sea, and find your way back. So it was random. The kind of construction of the work definitely had a random aspect.
Each sensor controls a different amount of clips.
Yeah.
And it randomizes those clips.
Yes, it randomizes the clips. Right. So the only change that really happens is the only thing that's controlled in the work is when it gets to this point, and then it starts all over again. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Where do these images come from? Do you store them in the computer memory or on laser disks?
Do we store them in the computer memory?
Store these images in the computer memory or on laser disks?
They're in the computer memory. Yeah, so a whole drive of the computer was absolutely given over to this work. So, and then, of course, the construction of the connectors to the sensors and whatnot. We changed the second time we installed this into columns inside the space. So it looked much more beautiful, and it was a larger area for people to walk around in. The first time we installed it, it's a rear view projection. We didn't have enough space.
Where exactly did you get the imagery from?
A lot of it was constructed. It was constructed by, I worked with dancers to create the trauma narratives. And then the graphics that we used in the myth section were partly taken from photographs that we created. In some cases, most of it was done with After Effects. And so the concept was difficult, and I still have questions about doing a work like this. In a way, it was I had done a website, but to do a work like this, which is an installation work, where the audience, and it was a multi-user audience. I was trying to do something very serious about proposing this question of healing in the work, and I'm not sure really what happened. I have to do some kind of, I've had various feedbacks, but to know definitely how successful it is another question. And of course, this leads you on to do other works where you feel as though you've learned something from the experience of doing that. Because you lose control. You have to lose control. So the way I chose to construct meaning, where total control is lost, is different from earlier works such as Storm from Paradise, Anamnesia, Parthenia, and Black Box, which are all ones that I might have a chance to refer to if there's enough time. And I regard these works as sort of crossings, kinds of works that are leading me to experiment more with interactive forms. The greater openness of interactive work both challenges the concept of aura we've been discussing and affirms it as what Walter Benjamin noted as a whirlpool, quote, a whirlpool of interactive contentions, a dialectic space of awakening for meaning. I like this quote of his because I hope that there is a kind of dialectic involved in people being open to experiencing an artwork, interactive work. Yet embedded in the social agency structure of making the technological artwork is a possible way of coming to insight and meaning through an intermediary process, one we can describe as an auratic process, because it brings the spectator agent by an unknown way through a process where meaning can be constructed. So how can we describe this process of finding meaning in works? It is a kind of process that is hard to describe, and yet you understand it. It becomes part of a meaning that you have as a fresh insight. The greater intermediary role of the artist places him or her at the site of a web of communication and community as an agent for a speaking between with the human position of the viewer participant. To be effective within these new conditions, the poetic, philosophic, and technological strategies artists employ to generate interactive visual works must reflect our most current concepts and methods of knowing the world, and to confront fully the implications, constraints, and opportunities that arise from conceiving forms of communication as art. I'd like to show you another work. Could you show part of the Storm piece, please? It's a video projection installation which is based on a text, As It Happens, by Walter Benjamin. And I created the work as a sort of commentary on the end of this century about progress, what he thought of progress and the idea of the angel of history. And really, I suppose the piece asks the question about where we are and can we reconstruct in a more progressive way. So this work actually was projected through quite a few layers of scrim, see-through scrim. However, I don't have a good documentation of that, so I'm simply showing you images from the work itself without you being able to see these layers of scrim that were in the final. This was last year. went away from a strategy that I often use for construction of meaning, and that is the idea of montage. It was used to some extent at the beginning of it, and then it became much more an animation. And of course the text was very strong in deciding how I would move forward with this particular piece. I'd like to show you some slides now. This is a work called Anamnesia, where I use text in a very different way. Anamnesia is the idea of recalling to memory. I guess I've been very involved in all these historical pieces that have to do with healing and very much looking back and seeing where we have come from. So this piece deals also with healing and questioning the process that we've been going through. In this case, I made this in 1993, and it was dealing a lot with the AIDS question. And what I did to construct this was to take texts. I actually wrote the text myself, and I projected them into vapor. It's hard to see this, but you can see that there are these white areas and that there are words below them. So those were vapor clouds, and the images were projected into them so that they seemed sort of like a psychological layering. The words kind of hovered in the air, you could say. So the images actually moved from sort of like a wiping movement. This was in 1993, so I was using the newest form of Premiere, I remember. And so I was able to create this wiping movement as though these images were being wiped to one side. And so I used images that had a lot to do with illness, with prosthetic devices, images that tried to deal with the technology becoming part of the body, and with illness as part of the losses that we were feeling. So I've used, in my work, I use images from many different sources. For instance, this one is a picture of a child from Sarajevo. I don't know why I'm telling you this, because maybe some of you are wondering where most of my imagery comes from. I've become very involved in seeking out images in magazines, newspapers, everywhere, and creating a sort of montage situation with them. That's the strategy. In this one, this is a work called Parthenia, and in this one I actually used, you can see on this wall, this is a wall inside the Queen's Museum, it was a monument to victims of domestic violence, and these high walls, these were 10-foot high walls around the work, around the monument, which you can see on this side. This was a 2-channel video, and there were also words that were on a projector that was turning, so the words were moving around the room. But I also had sent out around the country brochures asking people to write about their experiences of domestic violence, and that was a very moving aspect to this work and led to my first website. So this one goes back to 1995, where I felt that a website was one of the most suitable kind of outcome for this work, having to do with the fact that it was a very public sort of statement. So this was an extremely high room inside the Queen's Museum, And so it's difficult to imagine the size of these projections and the space there. But part of the construction of meaning had to do with the relationships within the two-channel medium and the words themselves. And this is a much earlier work. This one's called Black Box, and it was dealing with looking at the present through the lens of the future. So the whole piece was designed as a spaceship that you would go into, and you would be walking around within the spaceship. You can see the front windows of it, like two eyes, in the slide on this side. And there were 5 hanging sites which had different projections in them, each one with a different topic that it was addressing about conditions having to do with the environment, with family situations, with genetic engineering, this kind of choice of topics. And again, with slide projections and words that were swirling around the whole area, using a lot of statistics. So you were really supposed to be on a spaceship. You were supposed to be looking at these sites and connecting the words with the projections on the sites. So that was what I was doing in 1992. So during the past 10 years, my work has connected always with the idea of montage, and more lately, it's becoming more involved with interactive issues and finding very different ways of seeking how I can construct meaning with the interests that I have and the kind of themes that I still find interesting. So just to tell you, I'm working on a new website now, which is testing me a lot. But I'm deeply involved with the fact that it should be an interactive work, feeling that that's something, a direction that I really want to go into. So I'll stop here and see whether any of you have questions. Any thoughts?
Can you just talk a little bit about the website that you're working on now?
The one that I'm working on now is going to have many different parts to it. A lot of it will be involved with getting people's personal narratives, involved with asking them to be able to share with others turning points in their lives. And so in sharing these turning points, the narrative will be connected in different ways to a data bank of other narratives, so that people can will be able to go into the site and interrogate these narratives through various means, including sort of intelligent agents, to seek information about economic issues, issues that have to do with historical issues, gender issues, race issues. So it's meant to cover very different kinds of personal narratives, so that there will be different lenses that one can see these stories through and find connections, sociological ones, ones that will help to, I think, create a much wider view of what a life has been about. Certainly, a turning point in one's life makes one think in very general terms to a great extent. And it's interesting to see how much research is going on about that in the field of sociology to try to understand the changing populations that we have. So I'm actually starting to work on this with a database from Queens, where I live in New York, which is probably the most diverse part of the country, although being here in Los Angeles makes me aware that it's not the only place that's that diverse. So I see that on this site there are also going to be places in it where people will be able to read literary accounts, for instance, things from Shakespeare, things from Alice in Wonderland, things that will bring up ideas about what life is that has been suggested by different peoples, different writers and different performers, how they are really, I don't know whether you think your life is a stage, for example, or whether it's a tree, or whether it's a beach, or whatever, but there will be parts in the website that are kind of literary, and there'll also be a place for performance. So I envisage it as a site which will have many different aspects to it.
Do you have a working title for it?
I'm just calling it Turns. Mm-hmm.
Anybody? Well, I'll hog the mic then. You have a question? Go ahead.
What do you think the new, I don't know even what to call it, sort of global civilization, digital civilization, has done to some of these issues about experience and memory as you've been tracking it over the last 10 years? What transitions do you see? Because there's obviously something massive and in a strange way very stealthful about a process, but it's still massive.
Well, I think that Edward Said spoke very compellingly about one of the most important hallmarks of the century has been immigration. Migrations was the word that he used, of populations. And we certainly are experiencing it here, but in other parts of the world, whether it's in Asia or Africa, we're experiencing enormous change as a result of populations having to move for all the reasons that are happening. And I think people feel the tragedy of this in their lives. But at the same time, it's opening up to interesting prospects for hybrids that are occurring, hybrid forms of culture. And I think that's a hallmark for culture, that it's going to be a hybrid future where we're finding newness in the interstices between the old and where things are coming together between different populations, different ethnic backgrounds, different ways of doing things, bringing Asian culture and mixing it with our culture. I think we're seeing a lot of that happening in music and in theater, and I think it's definitely a source of a new source for exciting things.
Since you're living in the city that is probably the 19th century version of this diasporic process, what's unique about the way it's happening now? I mean, if you imagine the 20 million people that went through New York at one time, and LA, I think there are 75 languages recognized in the school district alone.
Yes. Well, I think it's because there's far more openness to multicultural activity that has just reached a point now where we have the kind of communications that are going on, certainly, and the fights that have gone on for racial and ethnic awareness, I think, has made a huge difference. And perhaps some of that has gotten transferred to Europe, although I understand in Europe they're finding it harder to accept the migration of people there, even though they need new workers. They're not willing to accept changes in their basic cultural structure. They still have a problem with race issues and ethnic issues. Not to say that we don't, but I think that we're much more used to this diversity, and that there's been a great acceptance actually of different cultural forms that are really coming a lot through music. Music is often the first area that where you can see cultural changes happening quickly.
Okay, I have a couple of things, but from the various projects that we've seen,
The various what?
projects that we've
Projects?
seen here, have you approached each one first with the concept, or like when you come up with an idea, do you usually just think of the best form for it, for the certain issue that you're interested in revealing and experimenting with, or do you tend to want to work with a certain technology and find an appealing, interesting issue, social issue, or whatever that may be, that can work well with that technology?
That's a really good question. Usually it's very much involved with what I am concerned about. That's where it starts. I'm concerned about an issue. I want to know a lot more about it. I feel that it's something that needs to be said or needs to be expressed. And I start off with that, a really strong feeling that I want to be involved with that as a theme. And for instance, I should pass these around. These are some of my books. So I've made a lot of artist books that also construct meaning in different ways. But for instance, with this one about Labyrinth, I was very involved. That was made about 1991. And I was very involved with gender issues. And so this book is an exploration of that. And the form usually very much comes out of the theme. Very often I use the same theme in creating an installation as I do in creating the book, although it takes on a different form. And I do a huge amount of research. I do a lot of image research, I do a lot of reading, I try to also understand the theoretical issues that are coming out of what I'm doing. So it often may take me a couple of years to actually do a new work. With the books, it's really, it takes even longer maybe than 2 years, because you always have to find a means of printing them and distributing them. So the two books that I happen to bring, one of them is called Paradoxic Mutations. So it's about modernism and postmodernism, hybridity and linearity. And it's a way of expressing these things that I couldn't do in any other form. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good. And you were also saying that you were interested in incorporating performance on this new website.
Yes.
And how would
that work?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking into that. I think that this website could also be a performance. That it could be used as a space for performance, or where it's projected and people could enter the space and create works there. There could be parts available for people as part of their identity. I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of things I could do with relation to that. And some of the archive could be saved within that part of the website. I also see taking some of the narratives and performing them, that they could become part of another work. And that probably there may be a book coming out of it too. I don't know. I'm just really conceptualizing it. And I haven't really, I've now conceptualized the navigation of it and, you know, the structure of it, and now I have to do it. I have to find the wherewithal of doing it. Okay.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you.
Okay. I was just going to try to